Hello, my name is Dimitrios Karakostas. I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and I consult with AHK. And this is a joint work with Angelos Kayas, who is my supervisor at the university. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to secure a ledger, and more specifically a proof of work ledger, using checkpointing. And when I say secure it against what? So the problem with distributed ledgers is what happens when the honest majority assumption fails. So that means when the majority of people that participate in proof of work and secure the system turn against it, become adversarial. The most common type of attacks that happens in that case is 51% attacks, or as we call them, double spending attacks. And these attacks have been pretty devastating. So they've cost tens of millions of dollars worth in cryptocurrency in systems like Zencash, Ethereum Classic, Pied Piper. But they're not the only types of attacks. There are also what we call liveness attacks, or mostly associated with censorship. So these attacks try to censor some transactions from being published, and they may be transactions from a specific party, like an exchange, or they might be full-on denial of service attacks, like, for example, producing empty blocks and not allowing anybody to transact on the network. So when honest majority fails, what can we do? And the more interesting question that we're going to look into is what can we do such that the ledger maintenance, or in other words, the existence of proof of work, does not become trivialized. It still makes sense to run the ledger as it were, but in a way that protects it against an adversarial majority. So here's an overview of how I'm going to go about. So first of all, we're going to describe what checkpoints are and how they can be used to secure an otherwise insecure ledger. So first of all, I'm going to describe an ideal functionality which defines the security properties that we want to achieve from checkpointing. Then I'm going to analyze the security guarantees that this functionality provides us. And I'm going to apply these guarantees in an example. And this is an Ethereum Classic instance, which I am going to assume suffers from an adversarial majority. I am going to assume that the 51% adversary exists. And I'm going to see how checkpointing can help secure this instance of Ethereum Classic. And finally, I'm going to implement the functionality. I'm going to build the functionality using some standard cryptographic primitives and analyze the performance of the protocol that realizes the functionality. In the second part of the presentation, which is smaller, I'm going to describe how we can implement checkpoints in a decentralized fashion. And this can be done via timestamping. So what are our goals in this work? So we have three major goals. First of all, we want to temporarily secure a ledger against 51% attacks. We don't want to create a new consensus protocol or to incorporate checkpoints in the consensus of an existing ledger. We just want to give it a boost to help a ledger when things are bad, when it suffers from 51% attacks. The second goal is to avoid trivializing the ledger maintenance, like I said. We don't want to take all the power from the miners and put it to the checkpointing functionality. We want the checkpointing functionality to do the bare minimum such that the ledger is secure. And finally, we want a good performance. We want to minimize both the storage and the time overhead that checkpointing introduces into the system. So the core idea to protect the system if a 51% adversary exists is to introduce an external set of parties that guarantee security. So the problem with 51% attackers is that the root of trust fails, because the root of trust in general is proof of work. Now, if we can't trust proof of work, we need somebody to trust in order to agree on what the correct ledger is. And that somebody needs to be someone outside of the system. So this is why we introduce an external set of parties that practically checkpoint the ledger. Now, before we proceed with our analysis, let me just give a brief overview of what our preliminaries are, what our assumptions are. So in our theoretical analysis, we make some standard assumptions. For example, we assume that there is a fixed number of parties. In the real world, this translates to a fixed number of machines that run proof of work. We have a round-based execution where all messages are delivered by the end of the round. So in other words, we have a synchronous network. And the block size, we assume that it is unlimited. This is to simplify our analysis, but it doesn't really restrict, is not as restrictive as it seems with respect to the real world, because we can simulate an unlimited block size in the real world. And then each party has Q queries to random oracle, which in the real world means that we have a machine that can ask a specific number of questions to the hashing function, or to produce a specific number of hashes. And each query is successful with probability P, and this depends on the difficulty of the network. Now, the adversary controls T out of the whole N parties and is adaptive. That means that they can corrupt parties on the fly as they wish, and also is rushing. So the adversarial messages are always delivered first, or rather, the adversary decides the order of delivery of the messages to the various parties. So what are the properties that we want to guarantee, that we want to ensure for the ledger? So first of all, a stable transaction is a transaction which every honest party reports in the same position in the ledger. So for example, a node transaction which is in a block near the beginning is a stable transaction, because everybody has the same chain and everybody reports it to the same position in the ledger. Now, the two major properties that we want to guarantee is first persistence and second liveness. Now, persistence means that a transaction that is at least k blocks away from the ledger's latest block, from the ledger's head, is stable. So that means that if we chop off the k latest blocks from the local chain, then what remains is stable. So every transaction that is old enough is stable, and every party reports in the same position. What liveness means is that after some time, so if a transaction is continuously provided to the miners, to the parties that participate in proof of work, after some time, the transaction will become stable. So it will go into the chain, and it will go into an old enough block such that every party reports in the same position in the ledger. Now, how does checkpoint functionality works? So, as I said, the checkpoint functionality is the ideal definition of checkpoints. And what it does is pretty simple. So it follows the consensus rules. For example, the max valid rule that says that we adopt the heaviest chain in the proof of work setting. And every KC blocks, where KC is some parameter of the checkpointing system, it picks a random value from a set of random values, and it allows the adversary to discard some of these values. So the adversary can manipulate to some extent the randomness of this value that the functionality chooses. And then it gets this randomness, it appends it to the chain, and practically this is the checkpoint. This random nonce is the checkpoint. And how does that guarantee security? So first of all, persistence. How do we achieve persistence? So the reason that persistence is achieved using this setting is that if we assume that k, this parameter, this persistence parameter, is larger than kc, the checkpoint parameter, then at least one of the latest of these k blocks, of the latest k blocks in the chain, is a checkpoint, has been checkpointed with the method that I described before. And because checkpoints cannot be reverted, because the functionality checkpoints a block and nobody ever drops a checkpointed block, every block before this checkpoint that is in the latest k blocks will never be reverted. So practically up to that point, all blocks up to that checkpoint are stable. And this is a pretty straightforward way to guarantee security. Now, of course, it goes without saying that in order for this to work, the users need, accept the checkpoints. So they don't drop a checkpoint block. If a user drops a checkpoint block and decides to extend a fork that ignores it, then they practically become an adversarial party. Okay, so now that we have resistance, how to get liveness. And this is a bit trickier. And the reason is that The way that we will analyze liveness, the way that we will prove liveness, is that first we will show that if an honest block, that is a block that is created by an honest party, gets checkpointed after a transaction T is created, then T becomes stable and T is live. And the reason that this happens is that if transaction T does not exist in some block prior to B, so in the chain that B extends, T is not in any blocks, then because the block is produced by an honest party, T will be part of the honest block, because remember that blocks are unlimited and honest parties try to put as many transactions in the block as possible. And if that block gets checkpointed, then the transaction will be reported as stable by every party. So every honest party that accepts checkpoints will have this block B, and thus transaction will be live. Now, an interesting thing though is that creating checkpoints is not enough to ensure liveness. They actually need to become part of the chain. And the way that we analyze security, before I go into this, the reason why they need to be part of the chain, is as follows. We assume that the attacker cannot censor any honest blocks. So if a block is created, an honest block is created, at the end of the round, after some fixed period of time, for example, a few seconds, every party will receive the honest block. They might not adopt it, but they will receive it. Now, the way that we analyze the system is that we assume that the attacker and the honest parties mine in separate. So the honest parties have a chain that they extend, and there might be some multiple honest parties creating a block, but they will go on in their own path, let's say. And the adversary will go on a different path, and they will try to create a separate chain that tries to overrun the honest chain. Now, what the interesting fact here is that the honest chain will increase with some minimal rate, and this rate is regardless of what the adversary does. So, because the adversary cannot censor blocks, there is some probability that some honest party will create a block, and thus the honest chain will increase with some rate. Now, the way that we analyze the system is by using a stochastic absorbing Markov chain. So absorption in the Markov chain is the state where an honest block gets checkpointed. So the execution of the Markov chain begins the moment that the transaction is created. And if the execution goes into the absorption state, that means that an honest block gets checkpointed. And at that point, as I explained before, we have liveness, because the transaction becomes part of a stable block. Now, absorption depends on two parameters. First, the adversarial power, and second, the checkpointing interval, how often we do checkpoints. And the way that these two parameters affect absorption, the probability of absorption, is as follows. If the adversarial power increases, if it tends to 100%, let's say, then the probability of absorption goes to 0. And that makes sense, because if the more power the adversary has, the more they can try to censor a transaction, and thus the less liveness guarantees we have. Also, if checkpoint interval goes to infinite, the probability of absorption goes to 0. And the reason is that if the checkpoint interval goes to infinite, we tend to the non-checkpoint version, where we don't have checkpoints. And if we don't have checkpoints, and the attacker has 51% or more of the power, then they can censor transactions. And finally, if the execution rounds go to infinite, absorption goes to 1. So after some time, eventually, we will get absorption. And the reason that we eventually get absorption is, or we go into the absorbing state, is because even if the probability of absorption within a single checkpoint period, let's say before a checkpoint is issued, is very small, eventually, following the law of large numbers, at some point in some checkpoint period, the honest parties will be able to create more blocks than the adversary, and thus they will be able to get first into this checkpoint race. They will be able to beat the adversary into a checkpoint, and that means that an honest block will become checkpointed. So what does a Markov chain look like? So the simplest case is when we checkpoint every block. Now, if we increase the interval, the Markov chain becomes, well, exponentially more complex. But this is a telling example. So here, the initial state is, we assume that is 1.1. It might also be 1.0. So what does 1 and 1 mean here? So the first index is the number of blocks that the honest parties necessarily need to create in order to reach, quote unquote, a checkpoint. And this is 1, because at the beginning, everybody has the same chain, and whoever produces a block gets to be checkpointed, can make it, can put a checkpoint on it. The second index is the number of blocks that the adversary needs to create. So what happens when the adversary creates a block and the honest parties don't? Now, if that happens, and this happens with probability 1 minus h, where h is the probability that the honest parties create a block, and m is the probability that the adversary creates a block. Now, this scenario that I said happens with probability 1 minus h times 1 minus m to the power of 0. And what that means is that the adversary can create 1 or more blocks. Typically, they will create only 1. So then we go to state 1.0. Now, in that state, the adversary has created the block, so they don't need to create any more blocks in order to get checkpointed. But the honest parties do need to create 1 block. And what happens in that case? Now, in the set state, the adversary keeps the block hidden. They keep it private, and they wait until the honest parties create some block. And as long as the honest parties don't create a block, the adversary keeps their own block hidden. The moment that the honest parties create a block, the adversary publishes their own, and because the adversary is rushing, they can send the adversarial block to the checkpoint functionality before the honest block. And that way, the adversarial block will be checkpointed, and we go back to the initial state. So what this means is practically that in case of ties, the adversary always wins. So if we are in a state where the second index is 0, then the only way to go back to the beginning of the execution and start again is if the honest parties also go to 0, if the index of the honest parties also goes to 0. Now, what happens if we are in the case of 1.1 and the adversary does not create a block, but the honest parties do? Now, in that case, the adversary cannot censor the honest block, so the honest block will go to the checkpoint functionality. The adversary cannot compete with this block because they don't have a block of their own. And that way, this honest block will be checkpointed and will go into the final state, the absorption state. And then we have liveness. And you can imagine how this extends to the case where we checkpoint every 2, 3, 10 blocks, etc. Okay, so how does this apply to an Ethereum Classic instance? Now, in the case of Ethereum Classic, we see here how the checkpoint interval affects the probability of liveness. Now, again, remember, if we don't have checkpoints, the probability of liveness is 0, because the adversary will always be able to outcompete the honest chain. And if they create, for example, empty blocks, they will always be able to drop the transaction they wanted to censor. But if we have a 51% adversary, then if, for example, we checkpoint every block, after 30 rounds, which is roughly 6 minutes, we have a probability of almost 1 to be checkpointed to ensure liveness for a transaction. Now, of course, as the checkpoint interval increases, then the performance drops. The liveness can be guaranteed at a later point in time, as you can see in the graph. Now, the second metric that we are interested in is how much time do you have to wait? How much time do you have to wait before liveness is guaranteed, before we reach the absorbing state? And here we look into this number for 3 adversaries. First, a minority adversary, which has 1/3 of the power. Second, a majority adversary with 50% plus 1. And then a third, a supermajority adversary, who has 66% of the mining power. So in that case, in the, let's say, the middle one, the 50% plus one, the adversary, we have to wait for roughly 1354 rounds, which is kind of a lot to be sure that liveness is guaranteed. If the adversary has 66% of the power, then we go to a completely different scale. And this is why I had to use actually a different axis, because we have to wait much longer. Okay, now that we are done with liveness, why do we need to put the randomness into the chain, like I said before? And the reason we want to insert this randomness, these random nonce, into the chain is the block-lead attack. And this is something that we identified while we were doing our analysis. Now, the block-lead attack goes like that. Let's say we start from the genesis and we go all the way up to these white blocks. And we have this central white block. And then at this point, the adversary creates a fork and creates these two black blocks and this red block. The honest parties go on the bottom and they create a single white block. Now let's say that we checkpoint every 3 blocks. So the last common ancestor, the last white block, is the checkpoint, and then 2 blocks after, another checkpoint is issued. Now at this point, you can observe that the adversary has already won the current epoch, let's say the current checkpoint period, but also they have another block in the next checkpoint period. And if we don't restrict them from doing that, they can create many more blocks in the following periods, and they can extend their advantage indefinitely. So the honest part is, whatever they do, they will never be able to catch up. So the way that we counter block lead with the randomness that I said was that we refresh the execution with every checkpoint. So we restrict the advantage of the adversary within a single checkpoint period. That way, they cannot grow their chain into the future, and with some probability, the honest parties will be able at some point to beat them, the adversary, in a single checkpoint period and get the liveness. So how do we implement checkpoint functionality? And the way we do it is pretty simple. We assume a service which runs among some clients, and the service goes as follows. The clients pick a random nonce. Everybody picks a random nonce, and that might be a signature, for example, a randomized signature on a block. And then they run some kind of agreement in order to agree what the randomness is. So this might be a fail-stop agreement or a Byzantine agreement or some kind of BFT protocol. And then after they have agreed on what nonce to issue, what the checkpoint nonce is, they just append it to the chosen block. So what the miners do is that every K blocks, they send every block to the checkpoint authority. The authority just simply participates in the network. And every KC blocks, they wait and they get the checkpoint from the authority. When they get the checkpoint, they append it to the chain, and then they resume mining as usual. Okay, now we're done with checkpointing. Let me spend a few minutes to talk about timestamping. That is, how to decentralize checkpoints. The way that we do timestamping is that we assume a monotonically increasing counter. This is a timestamp, and we assume a service that issues these timestamps. Now, when we have this function, let's consider a graph of blocks like we see here, and we have a root, which is block A, and this is extended by multiple descendants like D, B, C, etc. So how do we choose a chain among all these possibilities? The way we do it is as follows. We go into the descendants of block A, of the root, and we pick the descendant that has the oldest timestamp. So in this case, because block B doesn't have a timestamp, we go further down the tree, and we have to pick between D, C, and E. And among these 3 options, C has the oldest timestamp, which is 1. And that's the reason why, at this point, we choose the chain ABC. Now observe that if the block B gets timestamped at some point in the future, it will have a timestamp that is at least 5. So because, as you can see, the latest timestamp that has been issued is 4. So at that moment, if when the block B gets timestamped, the canonical chain will change and become AD. And this is the reason why, if we use timestamps as a way to checkpoint the chain, we need to timestamp the blocks immediately after they are produced. Now, why is this the same at checkpoints? Well, because the moment that the block gets timestamped, the timestamp cannot be reverted. So whoever gets to timestamp a block first, this block will practically act as a checkpoint, because no timestamp can be issued that is older than the timestamp that the block gets. And how do we decentralize timestamping? Well, we can use an existing distributed ledger. So in our paper, we have looked into Ethereum and Bitcoin, and the trade-off when trying to get decentralization is that we have to pay, and we have to pay in order to publish some data on the ledger. And second, we have to wait, and we have to wait until this data is published on the ledger. And the way that we publish them, and the way that timestamp works in this case, is that we create a transaction that contains the data that we want to timestamp, for example, the block header, and we publish this transaction on the network. When the transaction goes into a block, and when the block becomes stable, the timestamp is stable, and we can use it as shown before. Now, the reason that we have to wait is, first of all, because at least one block has been created. So in Ethereum, for example, 15 seconds have to go by, in Bitcoin, 10 minutes. And if we want to be fairly sure that this block is not going to be reverted, then we have to wait, for example, for 9 minutes in Ethereum or 16 minutes in Bitcoin. And also, if we want to verify a transaction, we have to verify the position of a transaction in the ledger. So we have either to get a full node, the 180 gigs in Ethereum or more as it grows, or we have to use a light client like SPV or NIPA Pause, etc. Okay, so all in all, what the three key takeaways are: first, if we have an adversarial majority, if the adversary has 51% of the mining power, then the system is insecure. And the only way to guarantee the ledger's properties is to introduce an external set of parties that is honest in order to guarantee them. These parties can run checkpoints, and in order to guarantee liveness, the checkpoints also need to be part of the chain. And if we don't care about liveness, if we, for example, we only worry about double spending, then checkpoints can exist outside of the chain and work correctly. But if we want to guarantee liveness, the checkpoints need to be part of the chain in order to counter the block lead attack that I described. And finally, we can have a fully decentralized checkpoint system by using timestamping over a distributed ledger.